You're tuned in to the Circular Economy, Regulatory and Commercial Law Implications. This is an most of the day program where we hope to dive in to this topic of the circular economy from a legal and policy perspective. We've got a great lineup of speakers for you today, including folks that are Skyping in from Munich, but most people were able to join us here, and we're really appreciative for that. Before we get started, I'd be completely amiss to not thank the ABA and ABA Sears, see if I can get this right, Energy, Siting, Infrastructure, and Reliability Committee, or maybe okay, out of order, but I think I got them all in there, as well as our sponsors, RSR Technologies, EOS Climate, the U.S. Business Council for Sustainable Development, and of course, Leverage Green Technologies. Got them all there. As you know, we have water available outside. If we can get anyone coffee that's in the room, please let one of the ELI staff know. There's information about Wi-Fi in the bathrooms up front. And the final thing I want to do before we get started is to thank, I guess I'll call them the organizing team that brought this to ELI's attention and was really invaluable in helping put this together. These three gentlemen put in a lot of work, and I couldn't be more appreciative for them. So Ira Feldman is our moderator of the first panel. Also Roger Feldman and John Howes. They'll be around all day, and I encourage you to chat with them and thank them for helping us bring this to you. With that, we're going to get started. I'm going to hand it over to Ira, who's moderating the first panel. Again, my name is Brett, and if you need anything while you're here today, please don't hesitate to ask. Thanks very much. Ira, over to you.
Thanks so much, Brett. Good morning to those here in the room, and welcome to those online. This is the ABA ELI event on circular economy. To start with our overview summary, let me repeat what some of you may have already read. In response to the resource constraints, environmental pressures, and economic barriers that characterize our take and dispose economy, many have put forward a vision for a circular economy that would not only conserve and recycle materials, but also contribute to new technological, financial, and environmental innovations. As the circular economy approach gains traction with noteworthy advances in the European Union, in China, and in the US, it's becoming increasingly clear that adjustments to our system of regulatory and commercial law will be needed to further progress toward a circular economy. This session acknowledges that the circular economy is not just another buzzword or slogan, but instead is a serious approach to supplant the way global production and energy systems operate. For lawyers and their clients, this represents a new and important thought construct that will lead to legal frameworks better adapted to the 21st century. So the purpose of today's event is to explain the meaning of the circular economy and how it is being applied at the intersection of energy, environment, and materials management, and to present some of the specific regulatory, procurement, financial structuring, and other legal initiatives that are emerging to help actualize its objectives globally. I'm going to start with an overview presentation, and then I will turn to my fellow panelists, Reed Lifsit from Yale, Cheryl Coleman from US EPA, and Scott Nadler from the US Business Council for Sustainable Development. Let me start with my perspective on the circular economy, and that is that the circular economy operationalizes sustainability. For those who have been immersed in sustainability, and I am an environmental lawyer and a sustainability professional, sustainability is the integration of environmental protection, economic development, and social justice. In the 15 years since the demise of the President's Council on Sustainable Development, there's been scattered progress in the United States via executive order, National Academy of Sciences reports, and the good work at EPA's Office of Research and Development. but it's been frustratingly slow progress for those of us who see sustainability as the organizing framework for the 21st century in law and policy. Perhaps the circular economy, with its triple bottom line orientation, can advance the sustainability state of play. But as a sustainability professional, I recognize that sustainability is not everyone's cup of tea. So I offer another title for my presentation: The Circular Economy Operationalizes Industrial Ecology. We're going to hear much more on industrial ecology from our other panelists, including one of the thought leaders from Yale, Reed Lifset. What I have observed over the past few years, that despite the good work by Reed and others, and the reuse of waste resources championed by Andy Mangan of the U.S. Business Council, and EPA's embrace of materials management, industrial ecology has always been oddly disconnected from our legal and regulatory system. Perhaps the circular economy provides a path forward for utilizing the industrial ecology concept. And for those who were not excited by either of my first two suggestions, the holy grail for those of us in environmental law for the last 20 years has been the next generation of environmental law and policy. And I don't think it's an overstatement to say that the circular economy has attracted a great deal of interest, because for those of us in the Environmental Law Institute and ABA SEER orbit, that has been the holy grail. And again, frustratingly little progress moving beyond our 1970s air, water, and waste framework of federal statutes. Perhaps the systems approach, the cross-media approach, and the sector-specific approach of the circular economy represents the path forward for the next generation of environmental law and policy. To provide some context, I think we're all aware that we're referring to our present state of play as a linear economy, in which natural resources are extracted from the ground, made into products, used and thrown away. And this has been a highly successful approach for economic development during the 20th century. But in recent years, we've been looking for alternative approaches that can work in the long term, because economic growth in business as usual mode is increasingly challenged. Some of the factors at play are not only the environmental factors, as evidenced by the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment and the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity Initiative, which have documented the accelerated depletion of ecosystems, but also the increasing demand for goods and services. I don't know if we're affected by that beep, but we'll continue until we're told otherwise.
It's a positive effect.
So the challenges of meeting the increasing demand for goods and services will be unprecedented, with upward of 9 billion people on the planet by 2030. Another overlooked factor in the background context here is the recent volatility in commodity prices. And I would point out the factoid at the bottom of this slide that commodity prices rose more than 150% in the last few years, and that erased average price declines over the previous century. To give credit where credit is due, a lot of the thought leadership on the circular economy derives from the work of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. The series of reports that they've issued beginning in 2012 continues until today. Earlier this month, they released another report providing a roadmap for the circular economy. Some of their preliminary research shows that moving in the direction of a circular model could lead to significant economic benefits for specific industries. In particular, the circular economy approach can relieve some of the pressure on resource supply, commodities prices, and volatility, while at the same time replenishing natural capital for the provision of food, feed, and fiber. So why has the circular economy been gaining traction in recent years? Well, I think it's the combination of both the business benefits and the positive societal and environmental impacts. One could translate that to a triple bottom line approach. Many companies see the circular economy as a viable model to successfully tackle their sustainability challenges, to drive performance, competitiveness, and innovation, and stimulate economic growth and development. This slide, which I'm quite sure you're going to see a number of times today, is the graphic produced by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation and utilized in their reports. I will simply say that given the complexity of this so-called butterfly slide, we will hear more from other panelists on my panel and throughout the day on the various concepts and principles that are part and parcel of this circular economy graphic. But for the basics, let me just start so it need not be repeated by every panelist who follows. The circular economy system is generally regarded as regenerative and restorative. It primarily relies on optimizing two distinct material flows, biological and technical. Biological materials returning to the food and farming system and rebuilding natural capital, and technical materials being kept in production and without the loss of quality. I always look for the shortest and most memorable definition for any new concept, and my suggestion for that with respect to the circular economy is this quote from Walter Stahl, who was a leader in the performance economy school of thought. So for him, the circular model is the goods of today become the resources of tomorrow at yesterday's prices. Hard to beat that summary. To take it a step further, the circular economy is restorative or regenerative by design, and the key principle is that products, components, and materials are kept at their highest value at all times. The system intentionally designs out waste to use as few resources as possible to begin with, to keep those resources in circulation for as long as possible, to extract as much value from those resources, and then recover and regenerate those materials and products at the end of their useful life. Taking it a step further, and I will not go into detail here, preferring to let my colleagues take on that task, the rule of optimization in moving from linear to circular approaches is that the tighter the reverse cycle, the less embedded energy and labor are lost and the more material is preserved. Circular design, which many of us assume that we understand, when you break it down, that really means using standardization, modularization, pure material flows, and design for easier disassembly. Another key concept that helps one appreciate the distinction between linear and circular approaches is understanding the distinction between efficiency and effectiveness, and we will hear more on that as we proceed. So let me try to start to sum up by saying the circular economy, many people assume that it is the equivalent of recycling. Recycling, a fundamentally important concept, but that doesn't do justice to the circular economy concept. Circular economy is not recycling on steroids. The circular economy is lots of things, as we will learn in the course of today. There are these clusters of concepts and approaches that I've laid out here for you on this slide, including sustainable business practices and corporate social responsibility, ecosystem services and natural capital, product take-back, design for remanufacturing, the McDonough-Braungart cradle-to-cradle approach, and biomimicry. There's been a long history of eco-industrial parks, and we will hear more about industrial ecology and closed-loop manufacturing, a key component of the circular economy. But there are also newer approaches. Some of you may have heard of the sharing economy and product service systems. And all of this is being driven by advances in information technology and pervasive changes in consumer behavior. Also want to flag the US-based contributions of the US Chamber of Commerce Foundation. They ran a major event last year, produced a significant report focusing on US companies last year. We provided that link on our website. Companies are actively pursuing model alternative approaches to the linear make waste model that decouple economic growth from resource constraints. The companies that were highlighted in the US Chamber report included Hewlett-Packard, Philips, Tetra Pak, and SunPower. Going back to the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, their founding partners included corporate entities such as B&Q, British Telecom, Cisco, National Grid, and Renault. Back to my theme of sustainability in the US Chamber report, several companies are showcased and do not shy away from the linkage between their existing sustainability initiatives and the circular economy. Companies such as Dow, Caterpillar, the City of Phoenix, Arizona State University, and Republic Services are all showcased in that report and use sustainability terminology as equivalent to their commitment to the circular economy. As we move through the rest of the day and talk about legal and policy implications, it's important to understand that the circular economy plays out at multiple levels: the micro level, single enterprises, the meso level with industrial parks, and the macro level involving cities and regions and indeed country level policies. We'll hear later today about China's circular economy law. We'll hear more about Europe's 2020 strategy and challenges in the US market. Right now, our economy is locked into a system where everything from production economics and contracts to regulation and mindsets favors a linear model of production and consumption, but the status quo is weakening under several disruptive trends, namely resource scarcity, tighter environmental standards, information technology, and changing consumer behavior. Obstacles remain, ranging from current product design to cultural resistance to subsidized commodity and energy prices. Some of these barriers may fade on their own. Others will require new frameworks in terms of corporate governance, cross-industry cooperation, new technology, and new approaches to law and regulation. To end on an optimistic note, a shift toward the circular economy could generate by 2025, according to certain estimates, $1 trillion annually in economic value, more than 100,000 new jobs, and prevent 100 million tons of waste within the next 5 years, while at the same time restoring natural capital and ecosystem services that are the foundation of healthy societies and economies globally. With that introduction, I'd like to turn the microphone over to Reed.
Okay. Morning. So I'm going to give an all too quick, lightning fast introduction to the circular economy and industrial ecology. Let me start by just telling you who I am and why I'm here. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Industrial Ecology, a peer-reviewed international scientific publication owned by Yale, and have been working in this area since the mid-1990s. My own research focuses on extended producer responsibility, the policy strategy where producers are required to manage their products and packages when they become waste. And I also do some work on the flow of metals through society and resource availability. Right. And I'm a research scientist at the school, on the faculty of the School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. So we have lots of concepts, frameworks, and ideas, terms that are floated. And the question is, what is the circular economy and industrial ecology, and how do they differ from them? I'm not going to try and explain all the different terms, especially not in 15 minutes, but we'll look at these and ask some questions about where they came from and where they're going. At the core of the circular economy is an analogy to natural systems, specifically taken from ecology and the branch of ecology called ecosystem ecology. And the idea is that nature is very resource efficient, that it cycles materials in ways that both reduces the need for new inputs and the waste that is released into the larger environment. So if you look at this diagram, you see up in the top, when you have a small ecosystem relative to its larger environment, then you don't see as much cycling. You see more linear flows because relative to the ecosystem, resources are abundant, and the capacity of the environment to assimilate them is also large. As you look at a larger ecosystem, what you see is more cycling in response to the limitation of those resources on one side, and what scientists would call sinks for waste, the capacity of the environment to absorb those wastes. That's what we're calling type 2 ecosystems. And then if you move up to the planetary level, you see a somewhat closed system where the only major input into the system is energy from the sun, and taken over long time scales and spatial scales, we see a lot of cycling of these resources. And so think of the word cycle, and that's where you get to circular, that these resources are going around. The other term that you'll hear a lot in this context is loop closing. That is, these elements are, the cycles are closed, or sometimes also called closed loop systems. So from there, we go directly to this analogy for economies, where we actually do see cycling or loop closing in a variety of industrial sectors and human activities. And there are small cycles, there are connections between the cycles, and depending on which part of society and which industry we're talking about, there is some limitation or constraint on the resources and on the capacity of the environment to deal with the wastes that are produced. This is the core idea that drives this notion of the circular economy. So where did this come from? There's actually a long history. We could go back centuries, but we'll just go back a couple decades. For those of you that remember Kenneth Boulding, a prominent environmental economist, he talked about the spaceship Earth, again, this closed planetary system. And then Walter Stahel, who was mentioned by Ira Feldman, was one of the leaders in thinking about the shift from products to services. He variously called that the loop economy, and the service economy, or excuse me, the functional economy and the performance economy. One that I really want to highlight here is down here, industrial ecology. Now, these ideas were first put forth in a big way in a seminal article by Robert Frosch and a colleague in 1989. Frosch was the head of global R&D for General Motors, former head of NASA and deputy head of the UN Environment Program, a man with a really interesting background. And he explicitly talked about industrial ecosystems and drew this analogy between the resource efficiency in the way that nature handles materials, and that as a potential model for the way that the economy might also handle its resources. That followed with a series of work by the U.S. National Academy of Engineering and launched a global field that's been around since then doing research in this area. Following that, McDonough and Braungart, who some of you know, who developed Cradle to Cradle, offered ideas related to that. That term comes from a deliberate contrast from the notion of cradle to grave, a life cycle. They use the term cradle to cradle to highlight the cycling of resources. And then interestingly, by the second half of the 1990s, we saw countries in Northern Europe actually overtly bringing these ideas into their environmental policy, notably Sweden and Germany. Then you get to the 2000s. I can't read that little screen. So, and these ideas moved pretty rapidly into East Asia, with Japan, Korea, and China adopting them with various labels, whether it's the Material Cycle Society in Japan or the Circular Economy in China. Korea called it the Green Growth Strategy. And then in 2010, the Ellen MacArthur Foundation was founded. Some of you may know that she holds the record for the solo world circumnavigation in sailing. And while on her boat, came to an epiphany about the limited availability of resources because of her experience on the boat, came back, did some thinking and talking with people, and ended up forming this foundation and bringing together a lot of these ideas and giving them some push in social, in larger society. So you heard this. There are actually 3 developments that are giving momentum to the circular economy that bring us here today. As Ira mentioned, there is the circular economy in China, and I think we're going to hear more about that later today. There was actually a law passed in 2008 called the Law for the Promotion of the Circular Economy. So there's actually a statutory and legal basis for this. As Ira noted, it operates at 3 levels, and the major focus of this was on pilot programs. And interestingly, the motivation for this was not environmental, but economic development. Or China hands in this audience, it was the NDRC, maybe somebody can help me, National Development and something Commission, which is really an high-level economic development entity that was pushing this. And then we have the butterfly diagram that you will see many times. Let me take you a little further in this. You can see on the left side that what we have are non-biological materials and different levels. Let me point here, different types of loops, whether it's maintenance, whether it's reuse, remanufacturing, and recycling. And as Ira noted, this is not simply recycling. Now you might say, well, is this just the 3 R's on steroids rather than recycling on steroids? And I'd say it's more than that. So on the left side of the diagram, you see the biological or biogenic materials, what McDonough and Braungart call biological nutrients in contrast to the technical nutrients. And there they argue for cycling and cascading of those resources. A critical element of that is they say that resources that are benign and can be returned to the earth can move through one kind of cycles, the ones on the left, if properly constituted, and the ones on the right are ones that are not benign to bring back to natural systems, and in their view, in one fashion or another, should cycle in the economy as long as possible. Okay, so what else is different here? Well, I would say that a key difference from simply the 3 R's is this concept of the biological materials or biological nutrients and the technical nutrients. One of the provocative elements of this is that, according to McDonough and Braungart, and to some extent by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, is this idea that if we make the resources on the left side benign, so they can flow through our use into agricultural systems and back into the natural environment and get the loops to work on the right side, we can have a society of abundance, that there is not a constraint that because these things can keep going, we don't have to worry about efficiency. We can, as Ira mentioned, simply worry about effectiveness. And that's a very interesting and, if we get to it, a complicated claim. So there are these different ideas of the priorities of making the circles tight. That is reminiscent of the solid waste management hierarchy, that the cycles should continue longer, that there should be cascading uses, that is from a high-end use to a less valuable use, and so on, so that we're not simply doing one kind of use and then heading into disposal. And the idea of pure circles is that the materials or resources are uncontaminated and therefore don't run into problems in the second use from their diminution in quality or the impact of toxicity. One that I'm going to talk about because of its difference from the 3 R's from recycling is service over product. Now this goes by a bunch of different names. You can talk about product to service or service over product or the functional economy, the performance economy, product service systems. They're all more or less synonyms. And I'm taking an example here from Philips. So they are developing what they call pay per lux, or what is called by other actors as lighting as a service. And if you look at the diagram on the bottom, you see that actually on the upper right, so Philips makes and installs the equipment. They actually own it. And then the user, the building owner, the tenant, whatever, pays for a certain quality of light that is guaranteed by performance contract. When those fixtures or equipment or technology reaches its end of life or becomes technologically out of date, Philips still owns it and takes it back. So this is another variant of closing a loop, right? What it is that people want is the quality and adequacy of the lighting service. They don't really want to own, it's not about owning the physical artifact, the fixtures. So there is this loop where Philips closes it by maintaining ownership. My favorite version of this is the expression that what we really want is a cold beer and not a refrigerator. So moving on. So the third element that's driving the emergence of the circular economy and circles like these, in addition to the Chinese developments and the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, is the work of the European Union. Here too, I think we're going to hear more about this later. They've made it a key element of their environmental policy with last year they issued this action plan for the circular economy with 51 distinct action items, but I'll leave that to our next speaker. So we've got these three, and we see the ideas and the origins. We see these three developments that are giving momentum to this idea. And in some ways, the next step is to take it to the next level, to grapple with the complications and move this from interesting ideas and exhortation to actually thinking about how it all works. So I'm going to give you one example here. This is one thing you may have picked up as I've described this, is that the notion of the circular economy is primarily focused on resource efficiency and resource conservation. It's about, in very simplistic terms, resource preservation. It's not so much, there's not so much talk about the environmental dimensions of this, how this minimizes or environmental impact or improves environmental benefits. This is a chart taken from a very nice piece of work by Tim Gutowski at MIT, and this has to do with remanufacturing. one of the many ways of closing loops. And what this shows are a series of durable products and the savings in life cycle energy, that is energy from including production, use, and waste management for a variety of these products. The notion of the environmental benefit of remanufacturing is not only saving materials, but that it's a reduction in environmental impact, because on the one hand, we don't have to make a new product with all the attendant environmental impacts, nor by remanufacturing do we have to face, at least in the short run, the disposal impacts of those products. So it's very appealing, and with the circular economy, it's being discussed a great deal. But if you think about products that run on electricity, often it is the use phase, the phase during use, when the larger share of environmental impact happens. This is because this is the phase when the most energy is used, and environmental impact tends to correlate with energy usage. So if you have a product like a refrigerator, where the new product is much more energy efficient than the old product, that is more efficient in use, and the use phase outweighs dramatically the impacts of both production and disposal, in fact, you will do better to buy a new refrigerator than to remanufacture the old one. And what this chart shows is an analysis of 25 different products and looking at the relative savings arising from remanufacturing. The point of this is that there's more to think about here. It's not just cycling of material resources, but it's energy use and of course the very important follow-on to that, which is greenhouse gas emissions. So where do we go from there? How do we take it to the next level? Well, this is the back to industrial ecology part. So this oddly named field is the study of the flows of materials and energy in both industrial and in consumer activities. And it's the effect of the flows on the environment and the drivers, the influences of economic, political, regulatory, and social factors on the flow and use and transformation of those resources. This is the field that grapples with the knotty problems, the real technical details of the circular economy. In fact, people are now calling it the science of the circular economy, because the field has been dealing with these questions since the late 80s. And it is primarily the Ellen MacArthur Foundation that has brought these ideas into public and policy discourse. So I'm not going to go through each of these items, but industrial ecology encompasses life cycle assessment, say carbon footprinting, design for environment, and it's these concepts and tools that I would like to see brought to bear on the circular economy as we attempt to take it to the next level, to answer some key questions. For example, when does the circular economy produce desirable environmental outcomes, and when does it not? When do we face the kind of problems like the remanufacturing issue? How actually do we measure circularity in businesses and economies? How do we know when we're getting more circular? So if we move back and forth between, say, recycling and reuse, how do we know when we're making progress? And of course, what are the means of diffusion and adoption in different sectors of society? One comment here, so I haven't said anything about the regulatory implications of that. And one of the reasons why I haven't is because if you think back to that butterfly diagram, you realize that there are a lot of elements of the circular economy. So to say, well, what are the regulatory implications of the circular economy? You have many disparate pieces to that. The implications are different for municipal solid waste recycling, for industrial recycling, for remanufacturing, for large-scale eco-industrial parks. It's not one question, it's a whole series. And to ask it as though it were a monolithic thing, even though there is a unifying conceptual foundation, doesn't get at what's important. So let me just end by saying that the journal that I edit is in the midst of putting together a special issue on the circular economy, where we hope to advance the debate, take it to the next level of sophistication. Thanks.
Excellent read. Let's turn it over to Cheryl for the EPA perspective. I think you need to activate your speaker.
Good morning. I am Cheryl Coleman, and I am the Director for the Resource Conservation and Sustainability Division at EPA. And I want to thank you guys, first of all, for inviting me to join you and talk with you about our Sustainable Materials Management Program at EPA. So you've heard a lot of terms this morning. I'm going to have a little bit different twist, and we'll try to create a distinction about what I mean by sustainable materials management. I am not a social media person, but I have been encouraged to encourage you to follow us on Twitter. And you see our Twitter, is it handle? Okay. Twitter handle. I'm starting to feel like an aunt of mine who was 106, and my sons they gave her a cell phone and tried to teach her how to text, and she said, "Why would you give me something to talk on and then ask me to write on it?" But I am trying to become more in tune with the times, and so please follow us on Twitter. So you've heard a lot of terms today, and I want to start first by defining what I mean when I say sustainable materials management. And I know some of you are familiar with that term, but I want to make sure I ensure a common understanding. Sustainable materials management is a term that is used by the OECD, which is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and the EPA, and as well as other organizations, and it seeks the most productive and sustainable use of materials across their life cycle by minimizing the amount of materials involved and all associated environmental impacts. In other words, it's about using the right materials for the right purposes. SMM, or Sustainable Materials Management, encourages life cycle-based decision-making and collaborative and integrative approaches to problem solving. At EPA, we believe that through SMM, we must use a system-based approach to cast a far broader net than the traditional end-of-life waste management and end-of-pipe pollution management approaches that have traditionally been in place. And for us at EPA, this is actually a radical change in how we think about environmental impacts and economics. And we believe that all of these principles need to be applied at the community level up through the global economy. I think it's important to note that sustainable materials management, circular economy, COBE 3Rs, while they're not exactly alike, they do share some similar principles. We stress sustainable materials management because we believe that is determining which approach produces the most desirable environmental outcomes. And let me give you an example. A few years ago, EPA did a study of coffee packaging materials. Coffee packaging at that time, this was pre-Keurig, but coffee packaging at that time came in primarily three forms: the metal canister, the plastic container, and the flexible brick. All of you in here look about my age or a little younger, so you should remember all of this. So if you look at it, and I know that circular economy is not strictly about recycling, but at that time, that's what we were looking at. But if you look at it from a recycling standpoint, which of those containers would be the most desirable? Sorry?
Brick.
If you look at it from a recycling perspective, the coffee can, because it can go to a MRF and you've got big magnets there that will pull it out. One of the problems is a number of those cans don't make it to the MRF because Americans are lazy, as are other people, and so they end up in the trash and they end up in the landfill. If you look at the plastic container, you can reuse that and it can be put back. they didn't primarily end up there either. But if you look at the brick from a sustainable materials management perspective, in order to get the coffee into the metal can and into the plastic container, you have to transport those containers to the site where the coffee is. For the brick, you transfer a roll of multi-layered film and you package the coffee there. So you've decreased some transportation savings. You've done some transportation savings and environmental savings because you're not transporting this load of cans or this load of plastic containers. When it gets to the store, you've got round cans going on what kind of shelves? Rectangular shelves. So they don't fit as tightly and as neatly as the multi-layered film. So from a sustainable materials management perspective, we believe that that multi-layer film, even though it's not recyclable, and we're working with the industry to try to get them to move in that direction through voluntary programs like we do in my division, but that multi-layer film, and you see it all over now. You see flexible packaging. When you go buy things that used to come in cans and other kinds of containers, it's coming in these containers that really are not, or packaging that is really not recyclable. And that's because, again, Americans like convenience. I tell my children they buy their groceries and their gas at the same location. So grocery stores are not where a lot of young people, for example, get their everyday essentials. SMM can also play a significant role in climate change. As you know, last November, there was a historic Paris Agreement reached where nearly 200 countries made commitments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And the goal is to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius. The United States has committed to achieve an economy-wide target of reducing its greenhouse gas emissions by 26 to 28% below the 2005 level by 2025. And we've also committed to try to reach 28%. If you look at this, mitigation actions are not going to be enough. There's some estimates that we could have a gap of approximately 6 to 13%. We believe that through looking at materials and land management programs, we can help fill in that gap to achieve measurable GHG reductions while yielding environmental, human health, and economic benefits for communities and the nations. We believe that our voluntary programs through the SMM program can play a critical role in filling that gap. And there is also a role for regulatory programs that support SMM principles. I had a conversation with Ira this past Friday to talk about this presentation today, and I told him that I do voluntary programs at EPA, but we do believe that there are some regulatory programs that support SMM principles, and part of our work is looking at how sustainable materials management practices can reach into that world in order to elevate how we manage all materials from a sustainability standpoint and maximize those materials use. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. So how do we get to sustainable materials management? We believe that there is a legislative basis for sustainable materials management. And back in 2002, we had a report, Beyond RCRA, Waste and Materials Management in 2020. And that began to focus some of our efforts on materials management. In 2009, we published The Road Ahead, and that report included life cycle assessment to evaluate materials use across the U.S. economy. The analysis done as part of that report identified 38 materials, products, and services that represent potential significant contributors to environmental issues arising from the United States consumption of goods and services. Those materials generally fall within 7 groups: food products and services, textiles, non-renewable organics, metals, construction and development, forestry, and then that ever catch-all category of miscellaneous. The road ahead also had specific recommendations for the government to promote efforts to manage materials and products on a life cycle basis, build capacity and integrate materials management approaches in existing government programs, and accelerate the broad ongoing public dialogue on life cycle materials management. These recommendations actually formed the foundation of the Sustainable Materials Management Program that was launched in 2012. So when we initiated the Sustainable Materials Management Program, we had three focus areas: food, used electronics, and measurement, because what gets measured matters. We are moving into our new strategic plan where we've identified strategic priority areas and additional emphasis areas in my division. And as you can see, we are focusing on the built environment, sustainable food management, continues, and sustainable packaging. We will also continue work in electronics management, life cycle assessment, international efforts, and continue our work in measurement. These focus areas were also determined to and align with international reports from the World Economic Forum, Ellen MacArthur Foundation, and McKinsey. And we were really happy to see that we were on point in identifying the areas for our future work. With our life cycle assessment work, we really want to focus on building tools and becoming more engaged in international activities, looking at procurement, our convening power, and regulations that support SMM. Now, when I say regulations that support SMM, in 2015, the definition of solid waste final rule, and I actually came to EPA from South Carolina, where I spent 30 years in environmental programs, and I started working on the definition of solid waste with EPA when I first started at South Carolina, and it followed me to EPA. So the final rule was issued in 2015. And there was also a hazardous waste generator improvement proposal. We also believe that SMM is a global issue. In the G7 Leaders Summit that was held in June of last year, an alliance on resource efficiency was established, and that alliance serves as a forum to share knowledge and create information networks on a voluntary basis. Through that alliance, we hope to collaborate with businesses and other relevant stakeholders to advance opportunities offered by resource efficiency and promote best practices and foster innovation. Some of the alliance activities include a series of international workshops that have been hosted by G7 member countries. Germany has held one, the UK, Japan, and we will be hosting a workshop on March 22nd through the 23rd of this year. And that workshop will include senior officials from the United States and other G7 countries, and they will engage with about 250 to 250 attendees from the auto manufacturing industry, suppliers, and trade associations in the G7 countries. We're using the auto sector as an example of how we can really start to do closer examination into the supply chain from a sustainable materials management approach, but it's really an example, and we hope that out of this workshop we will be able to have additional workshops that will carry these concepts into other sectors of our economy. We have a lot of work ahead of us, and we're hoping to continue to promote our SMM approach by working with our stakeholders in the areas of food and packaging. As you know, or many of you know, in September of last year, the United States and EPA announced the first ever goal to reduce food loss and waste by 50% by 2030. You heard, I think it was Ira talk about the fact that we're looking at 9 billion people here by 2050, and where we are now, we will only have enough food to feed 7 billion people. So we have, Houston, we have a problem. So we are really looking to work with our stakeholders to reduce food loss and waste. We are looking at packaging. Packaging is a tremendous materials commodity that exists within our materials stream. We will continue our efforts around electronics and measurement and looking at how we can develop life cycle assessment tools to help us make the best decisions on how to manage commodities and our materials in the United States. With that, I'll stop. Please follow us at those Twitter handles there.
Thank you, Cheryl. That was great. Let's return to a private sector perspective and turn it over to Scott Nadler. And let me hand Scott the clicker as well.
Thanks, Ira. It's been interesting for the last hour to listen to my colleagues and continue to learn from them. A lot of smart people raising a lot of good issues. Let me raise one challenge that goes on here, though. Nobody at the front of this room buys stuff. It's a technical term, stuff. None of us buy stuff. None of us sell stuff. None of us make stuff. And none of this matters unless it changes the way people buy stuff, sell stuff, and make stuff. So what I want to talk to you about for the next few minutes is what the U.S. Business Council for Sustainable Development has been doing with its partners to try and take these great concepts and say, what do you actually do in practice and how do you make that happen? So with all due regret, full disclaimer, I do not have a butterfly diagram. It's a personal failing on my part. I'll continue to try and work on that. First, I need to give you 20 seconds on who we are because we're an incredible stealth organization. We tend to be so busy doing things we forget to tell people about it. A bit of irony, when I worked for a company, I brought my company in to the Business Council, sat on the board. Those of us sat on the board along with people from Shell and General Motors and said, my gosh, we really like this organization because, and we bring our companies in because they spend their time doing stuff rather than membership and marketing and all that. And then as we sat there on the board, we began to berate management and say, why don't you spend time on management and marketing and things like that. So for my sins, I then a year ago went from being on the board to being on staff, so I now have to take my own medicine. Very simply, who we are is a business-led nonprofit. The businesses that we are made up of hopefully are all for-profit. We're a business-led, effectively a business-led NGO that's focused entirely working from the bottom up, not the top down. We're not a talk shop. We focus on making things happen on a project level, and then of course the challenge is how do you scale those things up to the level where they actually make a difference. We've been working in this area, and it's a royal we because Andy Mangan, the executive director and co-founder, was working on what was inelegantly called byproduct synergy. Fortunately, Reed had the good taste not to even include that in the list of different labels.
That's a nice term.
The organization was working in this long before I could spell USBCSD, so I'm not taking credit personally. But frankly, this has been kind of a 20-year overnight success because the organization has been working in one-to-one relationships and in very small local marketplaces for over 20 years. In the last 18 months, it's beginning to really get recognition for a number of different reasons, including the policy, strategy, regulatory attention that's being paid, the attention from folks like the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, but also a lot of different factors are coming together. But we're beginning to get recognition. Locally, Austin, we won an award for economic development related to circular economic development. And our executive director went to Davos earlier this month to receive the Circulars Award for Digital Disruptor for our national materials marketplace. And that's what I really want to talk about for the next couple of minutes. What does it look like when you actually try and do this for real? The U.S. materials marketplace is just what it sounds like. It's not a concept, it's not a theory, it's a marketplace to actually allow and encourage companies, for-profit entities, to buy and sell materials that they wouldn't otherwise be doing in exactly the ways that you heard Reed and Cheryl talk about. The we were able to partner with WBCSD, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. We're an affiliate of theirs, and the Corporate Eco Forum to do to use Ira's language, to really try and go from micro to meso on our journey to this being a real macro level activity. So I'm going to use a royal we. These two organizations partnered with us. They should get full credit for everything I talk about when I talk about we. I'm just tired of saying their names, so I'll keep going and dive in. We had a lot of help because, again, it doesn't work unless you get people in the room who buy, sell, and make stuff. 22 companies, GM and Nike really took the lead, but 22 companies that you see on the screen participated. 78 of their locations participated. But we've had tremendous help. Reed and his colleagues have been with us from day one. But a number of other organizations helping us deal with technical problems, with chemical problems, with organizational problems, with IT problems to try and make this work. So how does it work? How does it work? Essentially what it is a software platform with a lot of help. Why does a software platform matter? Well, because if you're going to get to scale, people have to be able to put products out there without knowing a priori who's going to take them and what they're going to do with them. Otherwise, you're limited to the small closed loop of people who already know. So you have to have a situation where somebody can throw their product out there and say, here's stuff I have that I don't know what to do with. Similarly, people who are looking for this product can say, I wish I could find X. And so it's truly a market-making activity using technology that wasn't available when we started this 20 years ago to allow people to safely and efficiently put their materials out there, put their wishes out there, and begin to meet up. It isn't just passive. It takes facilitation. It takes facilitation on a technical side. You may call your product something different than I do. I may love your product, but it has this tiny little bit of methyl ethyl death in it that I don't want, and I don't know how to get it out. You don't know how to maybe distill it out. Maybe organizational facilitation. I may be sitting there as the sustainability officer saying, my gosh, this is fantastic. Sustainability officers don't buy. Buying is done by procurement people. Do you know what procurement people care about? They've got 5 principles: price, 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 quality, and price. Okay. And what do you think their daily life is like? Are they getting more people to handle the load? No. Their jobs, their staffs are being cut. They have more and more people and more problems being thrown at fewer and fewer people. So you better be offering a solution, not a new problem. So it takes facilitation to get them to play, to get them to pay attention. Interestingly, to Reed's point, is the range of outcomes range from near misses, like your stuff, but we can't use it, to transactions that works, I'll take it, I can use it, to ongoing supply chain relationships where that doesn't work, but if you could do X, I could take it, well, I could maybe design my process to produce more of X. That works from an environmental standpoint, but it's got a more profound business impact. And again, if there's no business impact, there's no real world impact. Reed talked to you about the cold beer phenomenon. I'm in favor of cold beer. But more broadly, the shift from manufacturing to service. There's a hidden reason for that when you look at it from inside the business out, which is manufacturing, especially for major goods, is frustrating because your customer interaction is lumpy. The classic was transit vehicles. How long does a transit vehicle last if you build it properly? 15 to 30 years. So if you get to meet your customer every 15 to 30 years, different person your side, different person their side, by definition it's beginning to become a low bid transactional activity. They don't remember you. But if you can be providing the equivalent of cold beer, if you can be providing efficient running transit vehicles, and it's your job to take the bad ones, fix them, replace them, you have an ongoing relationship. It's a relationship, not a transaction. It's less of a commodity. It's harder to be replaced, to be displaced, less price dependent. If I'm in business, I like that. So we see the range of outcomes here going from pure transactions to some really interesting growing relationships. What are the kind of things we're talking about? Let's make it very specific. That picture that you see is what's unfortunately referred to as steel offal. That's not with an AWF, that's OFFAL. General Motors produces about 40,000 of those a month in 12 different shapes and sizes. That's what gets cut out when you make a window. When you make a car part, you stamp something out. Now, maybe in 15 years with 3D printing it will be done differently, but for now, that's how it works. The consistent size, quality, materials, right now, that's essentially scrap. That's gone into the marketplace. There are 3 different firms looking at that, including manufacturing, including some architectural use. Potential impact if this goes through, over $800,000 a year in revenue for GM, savings for the buyer, and close to 2,000 million metric ton CO2 equivalents saved. This begins to matter. This is real stuff. What have we seen? We ran the national marketplace as a pilot from June to August, found the good news and bad news. Good news, lots of stuff happened. Bad news, too quick for things to come to closure. So the participants have agreed to extend it. So we don't have the report from the extended period yet. Just from the initial period, 23 companies participated, 78 locations, almost 2.5 million tons of material put into the marketplace, almost 60 materials that people said, I wish I could find this, 68 specific opportunities identified, and there were 19 transactions in progress at the time that the pilot ended, and those are all being followed through on now. Again, those range from things like the GM side to from stamped materials to red mud, bauxite residue, that's being looked at for, again, 3 or 4 different interested players, using it as a phosphorus removal medium, using it in sand production, using it for levee construction in Louisiana for coastal zone restoration. Real ideas, real opportunities that are being explored. In terms of what's out there right now, as I said, the pilot's been continued. You can see a pretty wide range of different activities, including packaging activities, as Cheryl pointed to, some real hardcore raw materials, intermediate materials, number of different industries and uses. Where does that take us? What are the opportunities and challenges? Again, given what we're here for today, this advertising works, we know that's not how things really happen. We know that's not how change happens. So what are the opportunities and challenges? Well, let me be uncharacteristically positive for myself and talk about opportunities first. There are a number of factors. There are a number of reasons why we see this coming to a head and getting the attention and the support now. First, there's just growing corporate buy-in. The people at companies who don't buy and sell and make stuff know that they need to do those activities differently for exactly the reasons that Ira and Reed and Cheryl have talked to you about. They're seeing they need to find ways to be more efficient. Behind efficiency is eco-efficiency. It's not a bad thing, it's a good thing. And we talk about waste. I've spent 35 years around business. I've never met a plant manager who says, oh, I like waste. You talk about sustainability, their eyes may glaze over. You talk about reducing waste and they're interested. Now they want to talk. So the corporate imperatives, including the effects of the recession, which in the short term stalled a lot of efforts, have really baked in a lot of attention on cost saving. Interestingly, on energy saving, even though short term the energy costs are obviously vastly reduced, we're not seeing a lot of pullback on corporate energy initiatives because senior levels of corporations know that one way or another, their cost of energy is going to keep going. It's going to go back up. It's going to be up in the long term. Do they know exactly when and how price per barrel? No. But they know that energy is going to continue to get costed back up. So it's not surprising or not irrelevant that this marketplace is driven by 3 business-led organizations, not by government, not by NGOs, 3 business-led organizations whose members want in and want to play. Second, as Cheryl pointed out, the momentum behind Paris has created a new level of momentum for businesses saying it's not if it's going to happen, it's not when, it's going to happen and it's got to happen now. We better be out front. Either it's done by us or it's going to be done to us. It's much nicer if it's done by us. And also the sophistication. As I said, to create a marketplace, you have to make it efficient, safe, and easy for people to throw the materials out there without knowing who's going to buy it yet, and to put their wish list out there without knowing who's going to supply it. Those tools simply didn't exist when we started doing this 20 years ago. They do now. That's why the award we won was the Digital Disruptor Award, using the digital capability to disrupt existing models. There are some real challenges here. The biggest challenge is, and Ira pointed to this, the good news is this concept fits everywhere. It can help you save water. It can help you reduce emissions. It can help you with your materials management, compliance issues in some cases. The bad news is it fits everywhere. No, Cheryl wrestles with this. She can't tell one part of EPA, this is mine, you stay out. Within industry, I don't want to shock anyone, but there are silos within industry. As my friends at Boeing used to call them, cylinders of excellence. I've spent a lot of my time in my consulting life working with corporate sustainability or environmental people trying to get purchasing to give them the time of day at the same time that they're working with their salespeople that say, what do we do with all these requests that came in from our customers? It's siloed. R&D has great ideas over there, but doesn't think anybody wants to hear them. So the fact that this fits everywhere means that you have to find ways to cut across silos, both within a company, across companies, and across agencies and regulations. One of the biggest challenges is something that's already been pointed to today, the impact on carbon. Intuitively, we can think about all the different ways that this can help. Case by case, we can look at something like GM and say, here's the specific savings from a CO2 equivalency standpoint. But think about the complexity that Reed and Cheryl have pointed out to you. To be able to say in general, oh, this is always going to be better? No, it's not. It's not always going to be better. How much better? Who measures how much better? Now we're doing some work with some of Reed's colleagues at Yale right now, this week, on what are some of the better ways to try and measure, understand, communicate, certify carbon equivalency. But it's easy for me, PowerPoint is cheap. I can say this helps. I can tell you what percentage of the problem it might help. There's a long way between that and me being able to turn around and tell a company CEO or CFO, yes, if you do this, you're going to be able to get Y quantity of carbon credits that you can have trade for Z value or use for Q regulatory offset. There's hard work that has to be done for this to actually work. That said, we are on Twitter and a lot of other places, but we also get in trouble that way too. But we have, because of the level of interest, we've actually put a website that is just specifically about the marketplace itself. So I urge you to go ahead and check materialsmarketplace.org to see what we just talked about, including the updates as this moves forward. All right.
Thank you, Scott. Before we open it up to questions, I did promise our panelists that I would give them another bite at the apple, and I did prompt them on this. So why don't we first stick with Scott, since you still have your mic on.
I have a live microphone, it's dangerous.
The question I have for you is, you started to get into some of the challenges and barriers, but what do you see as the biggest barriers to participation in bringing the circular economy to scale?
The biggest barrier is really the mental model, because we really are talking about a different way of thinking about materials. John Bradburn from General Motors, who is kind of a material savant, he's on our board and has been deeply involved with the GM Zero Waste program. John walks into the room with a different mindset. John genuinely believes, as an ideological and intellectual precept, there is no such thing as waste, it's just materials whose use has not yet been found. So John walks in and looks at a product, looks at something differently. Once you do that, then all the other barriers exist, but you work on about how do I solve them, not that's a good reason to do nothing. So the biggest challenge is that mind shift. And I'll give you an example. Traditionally, transportation has been seen as a barrier, and talked about tighter the loop, the greater the, and certainly wasted energy, and Cheryl talked about packaging and all the rest of it. On the other hand, once you shift that mental model, you say, there's waste in transportation. It's called empty backhaul, moving air. And if you can begin to match up, so transportation, light lanes in transportation are just another form of underused capacity. And if you marry up those lanes with where you have materials and potential uses, suddenly you may have energy and material efficient uses that you'd never, reuses that you would never see. But you have to get past that mental model that says there's waste here and there's materials here and there's a bright line. That's the biggest issue, that mental model shift.
Very good. Let me turn back to Cheryl. You've done a nice job of introducing EPA's Sustainable Materials Management Program. Let me give you a further opportunity to describe what's next, what can we expect from the program, and perhaps maybe you can also articulate what it doesn't include.
Thank you. As Scott just said, really getting beyond that stovepipe approach. We do have stovepipes, and that is creating opportunities for dialogue. We want to use the practices contained in sustainable materials management to really create an environment for stakeholders within the system to talk to each other and understand the impacts of their decisions on one another. You heard me mention food. Just having that dialogue between packaging and composters, for example. What is it about food service packaging that impedes the composting process? How can we package food so that we maintain its freshness longer, but also understand the implications that we need to buy what we're going to eat and then eat what we buy? Everybody in this room has purchased food that is sitting in your crisper or has sat in your crisper and you ended up throwing it out because you forgot you had it there. And yet we have 3 out of 5 Americans and children who are hungry. So what do we need to do from a systems approach to really begin to tackle issues around electronics, the supply chain, food, industrial materials, to get them where they are needed, where folks can use them, and also make people aware that they are available, and how can we use life cycle assessment tools to determine how to create materials that maximize their use and minimize their environmental impacts.
Thanks, Cheryl. And finally, let me return to Reed, and lest we waste all of those butterfly slides, my question may be related to the butterfly slide. I give Reed another opportunity to elaborate on the question of efficiency versus effectiveness that I had teed up in my opening presentation and others have referred to, and all the loops and cascades and other nice designs in the butterfly side.
Okay, efficiency and effectiveness. This is an idea that originates with Bill McDonough, the architect, who's one of the architects behind the Cradle to Cradle, and he argues that a policy and management framework that looks to minimize environmental damage is the wrong approach. He argues that through these notions of biological and technical nutrients and the cycles as he's described them, that we can look for effectiveness, that we don't simply have to accept this kind of pessimistic view that the best we can do is try to minimize impacts. I'm a little skeptical of that, actually, because I think that to run the loops you need energy, and that raises really important questions that we need to deal with. In fact, I think that the material efficiency that is, one way to describe the driver behind these ideas should really be motivated by what Cheryl said, that it's a means of addressing climate change. That is, we know how to, conceptually, we know how to drive down CO2 emissions, for example, through energy efficiency. It's not to say we've accomplished it, but we understand those ideas. But if you actually do the numbers, you find that they don't get you far enough in terms of reduction of greenhouse gases. So you have to do more than that. And I see material efficiency as one of the ways to do more than that. And so it's important to me that we focus on what are the climate change benefits, pathways, and implications of these strategies. Remember, we don't need to conserve aluminum. It's abundant in the world. We don't need to conserve iron. It's abundant in the world. There are things that are not abundant or are environmentally costly to obtain, but the universal prescription to simply conserve any and all materials, I think, distracts us from what's really important, and that is that we face an incredible climate challenge, and thoughtful approaches to materials efficiency are an important tool in this. I would say that similarly, that's the perspective we should bring to the different ways of closing loops. The question is, what does it do for climate change? Now, if we're talking about rare earth metals, some of those are hard to get at different times, and there may be, for example, resources that have wildly fluctuating commodity prices that from a business or management perspective we want to do. But if we're talking about the environmental case, I think that the circular economy needs to be grounded, among other things, in climate change considerations.
Thank you, Reed. We're going to try to break a bit before our 12:30 cutoff so that we can patch in our keynote speaker and have the people here in the room get their lunch, but we do have a couple of minutes left for some questions.
I don't know what I'd like to do is ask our audience in the room to help us with a slight scheduling mistake on our part. If some of you could begin to kind of get your lunch as we field questions from others, is that going to be okay here? Because we do want to give plenty of time. And a reminder to those of you joining us on the webinar, you can ask questions through GoTo's question box. So if anyone wants to be brave and try to sneak out and grab their food, that'd be great, but we do have some time for some questions. So.
And for those in the room, Brett has a microphone.
Exactly. I'll get this to you, and please just speak into it. You don't have to be direct. It's more just to capture your voice.
Ira, you mentioned in the beginning of your conversation the connection of circular economy to social justice, which I think is quite profound. Can you connect the dot for people? How do you go from, how does that circular economy idea, how can that relate to or impact issues related to social justice?
Well, one way I can connect the dots is through the sustainability concept, which I defined at the outset as the integration of environmental protection, economic development, and social justice. But for those who would prefer not to venture through sustainability, let me jump immediately into the realm of ecosystem services. Services provided by properly functioning ecosystems that go to support human well-being. And when you get into the realm of human well-being, the literature is vast in linking all of that to social justice concerns with livelihoods, health, education, etc. So I think that path is reasonably clear.
Can I add one comment? A lot of the loops that can possibly be closed through reuse, remanufacturing, maintenance tend to be more labor intensive. And to the extent that one part of social injustice has to do with employment, then strategies that rely on that will help.
So Lee Paddock from George Washington University. I might have just a brief comment on the last question. The host of many waste facilities over the last 30 or 40 years have certainly been communities of color and low-income communities, and to the extent you can end even more of those practices, you might have a social justice outcome that's useful to think about. My question is specifically to the materials marketplace. I did a lot of my work in Minnesota. We developed waste exchanges probably more than 20 years ago. So the question is, what's different now? What's going to drive materials marketplace in a way that was tried but certainly doesn't have the scale we need for this kind of a situation?
Great question, and as you said, there's a rich heritage of different experiments, different projects that people have done, different kinds of waste exchanges. The differences that we see happening now are the ones I pointed to earlier. Number one, there are some very big drivers from the corporate side saying this can be a fundamental game changer in look at GM, who's got over $1 billion of savings. You've also got issues from the local plant side in terms of rather than exporting waste, creating more value. How does that affect? I came out of economic development. How does that affect viability of your manufacturing plants when you in fact are producing more revenue streams rather than waste streams? So number one, there's a corporate driver. Number two, you've got the policy driver that Cheryl and Reed have talked about in terms of climate change. And we're seeing that. You notice that from our marketplace pilot, we were calculating CO2 equivalents as part of the metrics, part of what we're looking at. Three is the technology. And we know, again, Railweed, before I could spell USB-CSD, Andy Mangan and his colleagues were working and found that the information side was a big constraint, including there's a lot of details we haven't gone into around how do you give enough information about your product to make it useful and interesting and start the conversation while keeping enough confidentiality. Who's the honest broker? How do you do that on an efficient scale? And so the technology is a much overused jargon isn't always wrong. Sometimes it actually means what it says. The technology is truly an enabler now. It's enabling us to look at scale and to achieve scale in ways that weren't possible before.
Any in the room? Here you go, John.
John Hausberg, Lenders Group. I'm the moderator of the second panel. I have a question for Ms. Coleman. Seems that EPA is moving more toward from a command and control type regulatory agency to more of an enabling type agency where you're going to be helping facilitate and enable the type of thing that Scott Nadler's been talking about, information exchange, market development, and that kind of thing. And I'm just curious as to, is that right? Is EPA moving more toward that? And how can you, I'm curious about the interplay between what Scott's talking about and what you are moving from to.
I would kind of argue that EPA has always been in that mindset that the regulations were put in place really for those folks who chose to not recognize the value of materials and how they're managed. We are, I think, in a position now to have more open conversations with our stakeholders to make the kinds of connections that you just heard. And I think there is a stronger listening ear. If you look at the DSW rule that I referenced a little while ago, it certainly supports everything that you heard about in the materials waste exchange. And I prefer to call them materials because I agree with a former colleague who said that waste is just a material that's in the wrong place because it can be used and can stay within that butterfly model that we saw earlier. So you're right. I think the EPA is having more conversations, but I also think that there is a recognition now of the value of what EPA can bring to the table, and that is through convening to bring folks together to talk about how we can best facilitate the movement of materials and the flow of materials.
I think we have time for one more. Great.
Hi, Mark Allenson from Carleon Group. I'd like you all to comment on what work you're doing internationally. I say that because we have a fully funded stimulus package to build a city in Southeast Asia. And so we'll be doing everything from waste management to materials manufacturing, housing, hospitals, ports, hotels, airports, everything.
We're seeing tremendous interest internationally in the marketplace itself and expanding the concept. We've got at least 5 countries I can think of offhand who've approached us. We have something that should be announced shortly. EBRD has asked us to work with them on starting a marketplace in another country. I don't think it's public yet, so I'm not going to say, but EBRD is we're in the final stages of the contract to be signed literally this week. The EU Horizon 2020 program is out there, and WBCSD has been approached about putting in, with our collaboration, a proposal for materials marketplace across Europe. So there's a lot of potential, a lot of interest. And in some cases, the infrastructure isn't really there, but there's a fascinating leapfrog opportunity here that says, as some other economies continue to develop, instead of developing a model as we did, that's very, very waste-focused, and then saying, okay, now how do you correct that? There's an opportunity to see, again, I came out of economic development, not environmental sustainability. There's the potential to build your capital stock in a way that's oriented toward this kind of material reuse to begin with. So there's a lot of interest, and it's seen as an economic driver. It's as a win-win. Avoid building up the waste and building cutting-edge, next-generation industry. So there's a lot of interest out there. I think you'll see within the next 6 to 12 months, you'll see versions of this in a number of different places around the world.
Yeah, I just want to say that there are lots of people thinking about how the built environment relates to the circular economy. There's a lot of work out there, and I think that there's a particularly big opportunities related to the development of infrastructure in that respect. I also, just a little bit of self-promotion, I've got some flyers about the special issue of the Journal of Industrial Ecology, which I'll put over on the counter over there for those that are interested.
I can have 20 seconds. In addition to what we've already highlighted, I did want to share with you that EPA has been working on an international level to create an interoperable LCA database. Lots of people create databases, but they don't always talk to each other. And so through the creation of a digital commons to get, first of all, federal databases to talk to each other, because they don't either in a lot of cases, but also to expand that to an international level so that we can share data. Everybody keeps their own data, but if you need data on methyl ether death, you can get that data from India or China or some other country and be able to use it within your framework. And so we are hoping to continue building that up.
I just want to offer my personal thanks to Cheryl and Reed and Scott for making themselves available today to join this panel. I think we very much succeeded in our goal of laying the groundwork and providing the context necessary for the balance of the day's presentations. And thank you all in the audience and online for joining us. We're going to now break for lunch and